Hi everyone. Welcome today to our session, How to Test Less but Test Better, a New Approach to English Teaching and Assessment. We're really happy to be here today at the ELTons Festival. We're also really excited to have a very interactive session with you today, so we really want you to be involved and have your say. If you have any questions, do put them in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen, and there will also be polls that will pop up for you to take part in. To introduce the session and our speakers today, I'll be joined by Mina Patel and Agnieszka Pazurak, and also to introduce myself, my name is Gemma Considine. So Mina is our head of research at the British Council, where she recently co-authored The Future of English Global Perspectives. And Agnieszka Pazurak, or Paz as you might hear her referred to, is the Global Marketing Director for Macmillan Education, where she spent over 25 years in educational publishing. And to introduce myself, I'm Gemma Considine. I'm the Global Marketing Director for Exams at the British Council, and I've also spent the past 15 years working in English language teaching, assessment and publishing. So with that, I will hand over to Mina to get started on our session.
Thank you very much, Gemma, and hello, everyone. I've just been looking at the chat. It's lovely to see how far and wide everybody's from. So thank you for joining us. Okay, so for the next few minutes, what I'd like to talk to you about is assessment from my perspective. So although I am a researcher right now, my background is English language teaching and training. So I'd like to talk about assessment from my experience. But as Gemma said, we've just co-authored the initial research from our Future of English programme called The Future of English Global Perspectives, and I'll be sharing some of the insights around assessment that we found from there as well. Okay, so generally when we talk about assessment, very generally, we talk about assessment as developmental, so formative assessment, usually used in the classroom to support learning. And we talk about judgmental assessment in the form of summative assessment, so end of term tests or higher stakes tests as well. However, I do think that there's a little bit in the middle that overlaps the developmental and the judgmental. So formative assessment has to be developmental by nature. If it's not, how are you going to support your learners and tell them, you know, what their strengths are, what their weaknesses are? So it is judgmental to an extent. And summative assessment, depending on how the scores are used at the end of term test or for any other tests that we give our students, depending on how the scores are used, that can also be developmental. So the two really, I think, work hand in hand. Now, if you think about developmental or formative assessment, really, the boundaries are not very clear as to what it is or how we assess. There are clear boundaries for sure, but it is less clear than summative assessment, where the parameters are very clear. There are so many questions. This is how long the test is. This is how it is scored. So there are differences in how the different assessments are administered, but really, if we want to, they can work hand in hand. What does this for me mean in the classroom? So it really means creating the conditions for learning. That's why we assess, really, in the classroom, to create the conditions for learning, to empower goal setting. So helping our students with ongoing assessment and also looking forward to a test, we have to help them learn how to set goals for themselves. Initially, we do it with them, but then they do it for themselves, and that gives them a sense of achievement, gives them a sense of purpose as well. It means assessing and being assessed. So very often teachers talk to me about peer assessment and self-assessment. So right from the beginning, we're asking students to assess not only themselves, but each other, and get used to being assessed as well. We're talking about being proactive and responsive. So as teachers, we do have to manage the learning cycle, which involves assessment, but we do have to also respond to the information we get from our students as well. So again, it goes back to using that information we get from that assessment. And finally, I mean, this is not an exhaustive list. This is just kind of a few things that I thought would be good hooks for us to talk about. Questioning techniques. So assessment isn't always formal. It isn't always an activity or a task or a test. It could be just using very clear and concise questioning techniques to check understanding, for example. So there are various ways that we can assess in the classroom, and we can help our students get ready for that final test through formative assessment. Oh, sorry, forgot my internet clicker. So I talk to a lot of teachers. I have a really, really wonderful job, and I'm very lucky. I talk to teachers and trainers and educators from all over the world. And one thing that strikes me is very often, especially when we talk about younger learners, teachers talk about them as if they are blank sheets. They come to the classroom for the first time and they've never been assessed in their lives. But are our students blank sheets? I actually don't think they are. I think they come to the classroom with a wealth of knowledge and experience that I think we need to tap into. So young learners come to the classroom, they've lived before they enter your classroom. They've experienced so many things. They've been assessed and have assessed themselves. If you watch young children at play, they are always judging each other. As a mother, when my kids were little, they were assessing me. Oh, Mum, you haven't done that right. Or Mum, how is that? So, you know, they have experience of what assessment is. However, what they do need our help with is what assessment means at school. What do we expect from them? So whereas before they come to us, maybe those little boundaries that I was talking to you about were not so transparent, and maybe they had to learn as they went. When they get to school, we can change that. We can support them a little bit more. So helping learners with assessment at school. Now, I know that you are probably all very experienced educators, and this isn't rocket science, but it's worth saying. So letting learners know why they're being assessed. What is the purpose? Why are we doing it today through this activity or through this test? What am I going to get from it? What is the format? How are they going to be assessed? And for summative assessment, that is often much clearer because, as I said, you know, the parameters are there. The number of questions, the different kinds of questions, the time length. But for formative assessment, we need to explain to our learners what that actually means. What's the content? What is actually being assessed at any one particular time? And again, there needs to be clarity on that. And for me, I think the last box is really, really important. How are we going to use the results? How are we going to use the information we get? So in classroom-based assessment, how is that information going to feed back into your next lesson plan or future learning? How is the information that a student achieves on a test going to be used? And I think that's really important. And very often we forget to help our learners with that. So for me, it means giving learners parameters for their assessment and being very transparent all the time. And this will really help your learners as they progress in their learning. Assessment and affect. This is something that is increasingly being talked about, and I'm glad it is. It was talked about when I first became a teacher, which was a very long time ago. And then we seem to like put it by the wayside, but affect, the emotional side of learning. So we're talking about things like confidence, motivation, self-esteem. An assessment for learners can be quite scary if they're not used to it or they're not used to a certain way of being assessed. And it's really important to have a supportive environment for learners when they're being assessed. And that goes back to classroom dynamics, creating that environment in which learners feel safe and supported, so that they will take risks, so that they can learn, and they're not scared of maybe making mistakes. It means that assessment has to be relevant. It's something that learners can relate to, whether it's to do with a topic or whether they're familiar with the type of activity. Assessment should always be engaging, especially if we're working up to a bigger test or a different kind of assessment. Should be tangible, should be something that learners can get their teeth into. Flexible. This is not always easy, but I think it needs to be flexible so that it can cater to different kinds of learners and to different levels of progression as well. And really importantly, it should be useful. If learners think that they are doing something useful and an activity is going to help them, then they will be more motivated to do it. So here's a question for you, and I'm talking to the audience now. So assessment supports teaching and learning in different ways. And here are some examples. Again, this list is not exhaustive. So it helps learners set goals. It informs teaching. It can enable teachers to provide structured feedback to learners. It can help learners to become more independent, and it can help teachers and learners gauge progress. So what I'd like you to do is pop in the chat which for you is the most challenging in your context. It's easy enough to say what we're good at and what we do. I'd like you to think about what you find challenging. So I'll give you a few minutes to do that. I'm trying to look through the Q&A now. Some people are helping learners set goals. Yeah. Yeah, helping learners to become independent. Somebody's put informed teaching. Yeah. Lovely. Thank you. Somebody's put C. Yeah. Oh, you can't view it. Somebody can't view the screen. Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for engaging. Somebody's put E, can help teachers and learners gauge progress. So one of the things about assessment I find is that, like everything else in the classroom, it is practice. The more you do it, the more you'll learn about it, and the more your students will learn about it. And actually, it's a journey that you go on together. But thank you so much for engaging with that question. That's wonderful. Okay, I'm going to move on. Right, so up until now, I've been talking about the classroom as an individual space, one teacher, a group of students. However, assessment, in order to work optimally and effectively, needs to be systemic. So I, as a teacher, might do something with my class, and then my students go on and they are taught by Paz, who might do something different. And then the following year, they go to Gemma, who might do something different as well. And that's, sometimes it happens like that. But in an ideal situation, the whole school will have the same approach to assessment, and it will be systemic. So the students can actually see progress, they can see connections as they go through the system. And Barry O'Sullivan talks about a comprehensive learning system where assessment and curriculum and delivery are part of one system that makes up any comprehensive learning system. So the system could be a school, it could be a university, it could be a country. And the comprehensive learning system suggests that the curriculum, delivery and assessment have to work together, hand in hand, in order to achieve the best learning outcomes for our students. If one corner of the triangle is a little bit weaker, doesn't mean the system will fail, but it means that it won't be as effective as it could be. And the system is bound by standards of measurement, which are agreed within the system. And it also sits within a context of use. Now, the context of use is made up of all the stakeholders within that system. So it looks a little bit like that. So the comprehensive learning system sits within a context of use, and these are the different stakeholders that have an impact on it. And as you can see, I've got their employers and parents. as well as technology experts, as well as teacher educators, the research community. But importantly, every comprehensive learning system is bound by socio-cultural expectations all over the world. Everyone wants young people to succeed in education, in employment, in life. However, the route to that success will be different in different systems. And so socio-cultural expectations play a very, very big role in assessment. Okay, here's my next question for you and my last question for you. In your context, whatever your comprehensive learning system is, or whether you're in a university or a school, what is the approach to assessment? Again, I'm going to give you a couple of minutes just to pop your answers in the chat. Oh, so we have somebody from India. Most classroom interactions are examination driven. Yeah, that's an approach. Grade driven, yeah. Oh, somebody's put comprehensive informative. I like that. Some have a balance. Some are driven. So we have a really good range. We have some that have a balance of formative and summative, some that are very examination driven. This is interesting. Somebody's approach to assessment is mathematical and is based on mathematical analysis. One day, hopefully you can teach me something because mine isn't. Okay, so this is really positive. Somebody says they're trying to start formative, but we are doing summative now. So really positive answers. Thank you. Thank you so much. All right, I will come back and chat to you a little bit more. That's my little bit done for now. I am now going to hand over, I think, to Paz.
Yes, this is.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mina. Are you still showing the slides?
I was, but it's disappeared.
Yeah.
There you go.
Here we are.
So tell me when you want me to move on.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Hello, everyone. And thanks, Mina, for that session. It is really kind of both what you were saying and the answers I was reading in the chat are quite the essence of what we tried to pass on today about that testing for not just the sake of testing, but also for the sake of building relationships in the classroom, for enabling children to become more independent learners, and for basically preparing them for success in life through English. And this is a little bit that we as kind of content developers and course developers and assessment developers on Gemma's part can bring into the equation. We are basing that on the well, many more, but actually to summarize the 5 main pillars of what we see as these end-to-end and complete programs for learning, starting with basically learning English and checking progress, always being connected to each other. And as many people in the chat said, bringing the right balance of summative and formative assessment and supporting teachers in executing this in the classrooms, because, you know, it's much easier said than done, to be honest, especially when you're dealing with a classroom of 35 very different teenagers or very different kids with mixed abilities. And also making sure that in the materials, if you could just go back, Gemma, 1 second, or Mina.
I didn't do anything.
Oh, it's moving on its
own.
own.
Okay. Go back?
Then I'm gonna test my memory then. Okay, so this is just making sure that these assessments do not always happen in a very formalized way. Of course, we have end of unit tests, end of semester tests, end of year tests as part of the kind of package of materials teachers get, but it's also embedding these small and very diverse check-ins that can be quite engaging for students, like peer reviews, like role plays, various portfolio checks, and project work that always provides the foundation for teachers having these instant check-ins and feedback opportunities. And then this is passing over to Gemma.
Yeah, thanks, Paz. So obviously it's been really interesting to see your feedback around people doing formative and summative assessment. I've also lost the
Lost the
slides.
slides. It seems the slides switch
They've
off.
disappeared.
Mm.
So obviously Agnieszka comes from a sort of courseware publishing approach, and as you can hear, is building in lots of formative assessment throughout the learning journey. And at the British Council, we tend to focus on that kind of external validation and summative assessment. So at the British Council, we're co-owners of IELTS, so we have significant experience in that kind of, that kind of big, almost it feels like end of learning kind of scary assessment that many people will have to go through. But we also have a range of other assessment tools that can be used really in that systemic way that Mina talked about. So to help learners really throughout that kind of journey from beginning to end of school, making sure that there is that kind of consistent approach through primary, secondary and upper secondary. We really think it's important that even summative assessment is still motivational, is still not a big, scary, terrifying sort of external experience that learners have to go through. And we've really worked on looking at how we can make our tests kind of motivational. So we have a test that's specifically for primary students, for example, where there's a kind of on-screen game and a storyline. And it's really that sense of, for teachers being able to get that kind of output, a certificate for parents and progressive learning and information on how to remediate as well. But in a way that learners don't feel like, you've had to go off to a sort of scary exam center, you've had to spend weeks preparing specifically for a test, because we really think that as we've seen, there's so much assessment going on and so many different ways to approach it that it really needs to be as integrated as possible, and particularly for young learners to be as motivational as possible. So we really try to focus on making sure we're integrating almost sort of slightly different approaches to assessment depending on the learner stage, the kind of key objectives and the needs at the time. So really looking at that sort of the right test at the right time to sort of minimize, that kind of sense of external summative assessment is something that can almost sometimes kind of break that learning cycle in a way. So really trying to integrate that with learning as much as possible. So with that, I'll hand back to Paz, I think.
Yes, and the next point we would like to make is around the teacher support, which seems like an obvious thing, but actually in the reality that teachers work, lots of teachers work right now with a lot of changes, not just in technology, but also in social context that always kind of identifies what the next goals of education are, and conditions that to a degree, with the fact that there is, as I'm seeing someone in the chat saying, lots of burden of and loads of admin being added to teachers. We feel that for the success of any kind of complete program, the teacher support is absolutely necessary, and it is vital for improving the quality of education and also the learning outcomes of children. Looking at teacher effectiveness, looking also at teacher retention and kind of burnout in various institutions around the world. Supporting teachers in one of what we find as publishers doing research quite regularly, we find the biggest challenge of all across the globe, whoever is, it's closing the mixed ability gap. It's the fact that classrooms are getting bigger and students are getting more diverse, not only in terms of how quickly they learn English, but how conditioned they are by various neurodiversities and other conditions that tell, already make it much harder for them to learn at the same pace. Adapting to change and also creating inclusive classrooms. I think I would like to link that to the next point and next slide we're making. And Mina, you mentioned that, this whole learning process is a journey that teachers and students go on together. And actually thinking of it, the part of social and emotional learning plays in this cannot be underestimated. This is creating that safe space where students can make mistakes, when students can learn to respect their emotions, not only the positive ones, and the emotions of others, which is the foundation for good collaboration and any kind of output that they will have in English in the future. And it's widely recognized as having massive impact on education, both in school, at work, and later on in life. And again, part of the program, which goes across teaching and validation, as Gemma said, is making sure we take care of that social and emotional side of education and bring it as an interconnected part into any program. That's what we're aiming for as publishers and as content developers and as assessment developers. So I think with that, we are moving back to discussion points and the Q&A.
Thanks, Paz. Yes, and I think we were going to ask a question, but I also see an interesting question in the chat around how to manage assessment in a multi-level classroom. And obviously managing mixed abilities is a big challenge for lots of teachers. Something that we've been exploring at the British Council and something we focus on is making sure that our assessments are kind of what we would call general tests of English rather than different level tests for sort of each stage of the learning journey. So that learners can go into those tests, and if you've got a learner that you think might be sort of A2 and one that you think is B1, they can take the same test and they'll get a certificate to reflect that, as opposed to having to think in advance, you know, oh, are these ones going to need to go into this level of test and these ones are going to go into this one. So that's one way that we're really trying to support around that sort of mixed ability classroom, and also looking at exploring adaptive testing as well, so that, you know, students are sort of seeing content that's more suitable to their levels, rather than sort of being overwhelmed maybe with something that feels way too hard, way too scary, way too difficult, you know, to approach. So I'm sure that we've...
Can I just add to that? Sorry,
yeah, sure.
I was just going to say, I think the idea of adaptive testing is so important, and the idea that students, if a test is at their level and they have a sense of achievement, that is also so motivating as well. Just one more thing on the multi-grade classroom is about differentiating assessment, just like we differentiate our learning materials. Sometimes when we have different levels of learners, differentiating assessment in the classroom, I think, is so important and not too tricky to do. You know, if you've been working with your learners around assessment, it doesn't take a lot of work to just change a few of the tasks to suit different levels. Sorry, I just wanted to add that.
Sure, great.
So
I think, oh, sorry.
Sorry, just wanted to comment on what Mina, you were saying, is that this is actually a way, and that adaptivity is a way to make, to kind of meet one of the goals of assessment that you mentioned in the beginning of the session, which is build that learner independence.
Yeah.
They are literally supported in that in a way that isn't very top down, but they see they can take their own path through the language and through the skills that they're learning and prove their progress.
So I think with that, we wanted to hand back to the audience, if I'm not mistaken, and actually get your perspectives. Probably something that's quite close to Mina's heart, because she's been exploring this for some time, is to ask you in the audience what you believe is the future of assessment. So how do you see, given everything we've talked about, the different styles of assessment that we've talked about, what is the future of assessment for you? Where do you see assessment going? So it would be great to get some answers in the chat, so we can share and discuss. So some really interesting responses here. So using AI tools, leaning towards formative. Interesting.
Can I just pick up on the leaning towards formative,
Yeah.
Gemma?
Mm-hmm.
So when we were doing the initial Future of English research, it was interesting because we talked to 92 policymakers from around the world, and they were saying increasingly there is an emphasis on formative, as I was saying at the beginning, to help support the summative that is inevitable almost. So, and it goes back to what Paz was saying just now about helping learners become independent, because when they're in a testing situation, they haven't got their teachers to lean on. They're on their own. And so there is an element of independence and having to think but for themselves. And I think the more that education systems link the two, formative and summative, to help learners meet their ultimate outcomes, I think the better it will be for learners, to be honest.
Really interesting, and a few people picking up on AI as well. So obviously AI being a hot topic, and I believe there's more discussion around AI during the course of the ELTons, but AI is really interesting in terms of the opportunities that it gives us. So we talked about adaptive testing, and obviously using AI technology really helps drive forward things like adaptive testing. You know, the test being able to respond and react in real time, ultimately to give the learner a better experience there. And also, obviously, AI can help us with things like scoring as well. So again, some of the tests that we have developed, you know, enable you to get those results kind of immediately because of those developments in AI, which are all kind of, I think, leading towards making our assessments more accessible, more motivational, more easily integrated in the learning journey. So lots of opportunities through AI, and lots of opportunity, obviously, still to kind of continue innovating and taking that further and seeing how seamless we can sort of make summative assessment almost. Yeah. Paz, is there anything that you'd like to comment on in terms of the future of assessment?
I'm just I'm fascinated by what people what our guests here are putting in the chat, and it goes, I could see that the future is seen like on a spectrum between two very, very different realities. One is that perhaps ideal one when we just focus on formative, when we just give feedback and take care of student well-being, and on the other we see robots replacing teachers, and basically no more testing because everyone will have a chip in their heads. So maybe that's a far and distant future. But there are also a lot of voices that kind of comment on it, on that spectrum in between. And I do agree that what you've said, and there are quite a lot of teachers saying AI can help, definitely can help in doing these kind of boring jobs, identifying where students are, and you know, just so that the various tools can make it more engaging, more gamified for students to take that extra bit into the future. We are seeing quite a lot of also emphasis here in the chat and in our kind of ELT community of publishers, where we do engage in lots of kind of thought leadership and thinking around neurodiversities and equity, and helping students get to the same end result, regardless of what they're bringing with them in terms of their condition. And it is interesting for me to see to what degree AI will play a role in influencing how we learn, how we teach our students, and in a way that either it will support us in bringing out that, you know, making time for the social and emotional aspect and bringing what is best in humans, or on the other hand, perhaps making us more robotic and more kind of box ticking. I'm not sure. That's why we asked this question, to see what the audience thinks, really. Any thoughts, Gemma, Mina?
Well, I was just, there's a question that somebody's asked. How can we use AI effectively to English teaching and assessment? Of course, teachers are our main facilitator and AI supporter. And I love that sentiment. I love the fact that AI supports teachers and not the other way around, because I honestly believe that we, teachers, educators, will not be replaced by technology. But this question comes up a lot when I talk to educators. And I think one thing that educators all over the world need to be doing, if they don't know already, is be able to evaluate all the technology that is around us now, because there is an awful lot, and it's really easy just to kind of pick that new shiny thing and think, oh, what can that do for me? But I think it's really important that we can evaluate how useful it is in the classroom, both for teaching, learning and assessment, so that we can then help our learners do the same. Because I'm not sure that our learners can do that. And I think it's really important for us to be able to do that initially.
Thanks, Mina. I think also there has been some really interesting points here around, so focusing on skills development and not scores, I think is a really nice call out here. And also there was a comment around, you know, in terms of that skills development, looking at that sort of 21st century skills development, looking at, you know, what it is that we need in the future. And I think that that's really important. And I think it's challenging, isn't it, to balance some of those needs that people might have, you know, to sort of say, okay, I need to prove that I can speak English at a certain level, or I can do X, Y, Z. And obviously, you know, for many people, that is a need that they have. For many learners, that's a need that they have. But also we need to make sure that the focus on sort of, you know, whatever that proof may be, doesn't actually undermine that kind of skills development, that 21st century skills development, which is really what people will need when they're using English or using other skills in their broader life. So some really interesting answers here as well, obviously, about it seems that the future of English in this group looks like a sort of AI-driven formative assessment, which sounds good to me if it can kind of then give you those sort of outcomes. You know, it's been sort of not interrupting the learning experience and allowing teachers to do what they do best and kind of support, as Mina says. And then, yeah, be able to instead focus on building those skills. That sounds like an interesting place, I think, for the future of assessment. That sounds like a good place for assessment to be for me.
Gemma, can I just pick up on one question that's in the chat and that's not AI related? It's
Sure.
actually about setting goals. And I've lost it now. It was.
Oh, I see. How can I direct? So from
Yeah.
Eric, how can I direct my learners to be able to set crucial goals?
Yeah, and I think that's a really nice question, because we talk about goal setting and I don't think it's always as easy as we make it out to be, because as Paz was saying, large classes, how do you deal with individual learners all the time? I think the thing about goal setting is, again, it goes back to practicing. Goal setting isn't an automatic thing. It's about talking to your learners. It's about talking to them about your class, your lesson objectives, the objectives of the unit that you're studying at the moment, and helping them to kind of articulate what it is they want to achieve. And it's about starting that journey with them. And I think one of the things when I was teaching and trying to do this, one of the things that I learned that nobody had told me is that, you know, learners' goals might not be my goals as a teacher. They might be different. And I think that's absolutely fine, because it's a process. Like everything else, it's a process. You have to learn to set goals, I think. And they may not be related to whatever language function you're doing in the class that day, but eventually they will come around, I think. But it goes back for me about the consequences. What do you do with that information? If you don't achieve that goal, well, what happens? If I do achieve that goal, what happens? And I'm sorry, that's a really brief answer, but I really like that question. So thank you very much.
Great, thanks. Okay, well, I think we've got 1 minute to go, so I think we'll leave it there. There are some great questions and comments in the chat, so really interesting to see that. Just wanted to say a big thank you to our speakers, so to Mina and Agnieszka, and also, of course, to the audience, particularly, I think, in this instance, because you've helped us really answer some of these questions, I think. What is the future of assessment? So thank you. In a minute when we close, you'll get a pop-up survey. So we'd really appreciate it if you could fill that out, because it really helps us to make these sessions as useful and relevant as possible. And I believe coming next, there'll be a few different, there are lots of different sessions you can attend. So if you go back to the festival lobby, you'll be able to join a watch party on using AI. So as you can see, the most innovative ways to teach and learn English, and looking at how to include and not exclude your other languages in your English language teaching, followed by the evolution of English, exploring innovation through language. So lots of fantastic sessions. I believe in the chat, hopefully there have been some links, or we'll try to share some links to some things you might like to explore further. So looking at the future of English and looking at advancing achievement, which is a partnership between Macmillan and British Council, where you can hear about some of the kinds of assessments that we've talked about so far. And I think that is it.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much for joining. It's been fabulous speaking to you. Enjoy the rest of your festival.